She didn't mean to make a scene. That's the thing nobody talks about later, when the story gets passed around and everyone has an opinion. They talk about the money. They talk about him. But nobody asks what kind of day Lena was already having before any of it happened. She'd been on her feet for 9 hours straight. The lunch rush had bled into the dinner rush without a gap, which happened sometimes at Rosario's on Friday nights. Her lower back had been aching since around 2 in the afternoon. She'd spilled iced tea on her apron during the 3rd hour and hadn't had a chance to change it, so she'd been walking around smelling faintly sour ever since. Her phone had 3 missed calls from her landlord, which she hadn't listened to yet because she already knew what they were about. The rent. Always the rent. She was 26 years old, and she was tired in a way that felt older than that. Table 7 had been her problem child all evening. A birthday party. 8 people, lots of special requests. 2 of them sent their food back. One of them asked her 3 separate times whether the pasta was gluten-free, even after she'd answered the question twice. She didn't mind. She was used to it. She smiled. She refilled their water. She brought the birthday dessert with a candle and didn't let it show on her face when they asked her to bring another one, because the first candle had gone out before they could take a photo. She was good at her job. She needed to be. Tips were the difference between making rent and not making rent, and right now the margin was very thin. So when Table 4 walked in at 8:45, 15 minutes before the kitchen closed, she felt it before she could explain it. That specific kind of tired that comes when you're almost done, and then you're not. There were 3 of them, 2 men and a woman. Business clothes, expensive looking, the kind of people who didn't seem to notice they were in a mid-range Italian place in a neighborhood that was still deciding whether it was gentrifying. One of the men was on his phone before he even sat down. The woman was laughing at something the other man said. Nobody looked up when Lena approached. "Hi, welcome to Rosario's. I'm Lena. I'll be taking care of you tonight." She set down the menus. "Can I start you off with some water or something to drink?" The woman looked up and smiled. "White wine. Something dry. Sparkling water for me," the other man said. The one on his phone didn't say anything. Lena waited. He was still typing. Or reading. She couldn't tell. He had dark hair, a little long for someone in a suit, and the kind of stillness that some people had, the kind that wasn't relaxed but controlled. "And for you, sir?" "Nothing." The woman at the table made a small face, like she was used to this and also tired of it. "Damien." He looked up. His eyes met Lena's for exactly 1 second. "Water." He looked back down. She brought their drinks. She took their order. He asked 2 precise questions about the ossobuco, whether the gremolata was made in-house and whether the bone was full-sized or a smaller portion cut. She answered both. He nodded without looking at her and said he'd have the branzino instead. Fine. She'd had worse. The meal went without incident. They talked among themselves. She checked in twice, refilled 1 glass, brought bread when the woman asked for it. Normal, she was tired, and her feet hurt, and she just wanted to get through it. The bill came to $240. She set the check holder on the table and said the usual words. "Take your time." She started to walk away. "Hey." She turned back. It was him, Damien. He was holding the check holder open, looking at the total. "Is service included?" "No, sir, gratuity isn't added automatically unless it's a party of 8 or more." He closed the check holder, set it down, slid a credit card on top of it without putting it inside. She ran the card. She brought it back. He signed. She collected it. She thanked them, genuinely, because she always did, and turned toward the next thing she needed to do. In the back of the house, she opened the receipt. $240 bill. He'd written 0 on the tip line and signed his name. She stood there for a second. just stood there. 0. She thought about the 9 hours, the iced tea on her apron, the 3 missed calls from her landlord, the birthday table and the candles, and the gluten-free pasta question. She thought about the specific calculation she'd done in her head that morning, how many tables she needed to average 18% to cover what she owed by the 15th. And then, she didn't think anymore. She just walked back out. He was still there. The 3 of them were pulling on their coats, unhurried, the woman laughing again. "Excuse me." Her voice came out steady. She hadn't planned that. "I'm sorry, I just wanted to make sure there wasn't a problem with the service tonight." He looked at her. The woman's smile dimmed slightly. "No problem," he said. "Okay." She held the receipt loosely at her side. "Because you didn't leave a tip, and I wanted to check if I'd done something wrong." The other man looked suddenly very interested in his coat sleeve. Damien tilted his head slightly, like the question was mildly interesting to him. "I don't tip." Something tightened in her chest. Not embarrassment. Not quite anger. Something that happened when you'd been swallowing things all day, and one small thing lands wrong. "You don't tip," she repeated. "No. Okay." She nodded once. "I just want you to know that I make $2.13 an hour. The tips aren't extra. They're the wage. So when someone doesn't leave anything, it doesn't feel like a preference. It feels like I worked for free." She hadn't planned to say any of that. It was too much. She knew it was too much even as she was saying it. Her face was hot. He looked at her for a long moment. His expression didn't change, exactly, but something shifted in it. Something she couldn't read. Then, he smiled. It wasn't a mean smile. That was the strange thing. It wasn't smug or dismissive, or the kind of smile men gave when they were about to say something condescending. It was quieter than that. Almost like he was thinking something that he wasn't going to say out loud. "You're right," he said. "I apologize." She blinked. He said goodnight to the other 2, shook the man's hand, and walked out. That was it. The woman gave Lena a look she couldn't interpret, and followed. Lena stood in the middle of the floor of a nearly empty restaurant, apron smelling like iced tea, receipt in her hand, not entirely sure what had just happened. She finished closing her section. She counted her tips at the end of the night, $212 from 8 hours of work, which was decent but not enough. She took the bus home because her car had a broken alternator she hadn't fixed yet. She listened to her landlord's voicemails on the way. He needed the rent by the 17th, or he was starting the paperwork. She got home at midnight. She sat on the edge of her bed with her shoes still on and stared at the wall for a while. She didn't think about the man from table 4. She was too tired. She just thought about the number, the rent, the alternator, the 17th. Then she went to sleep. She didn't know yet that the next morning was going to change everything. She found out the next morning the way most things happened at Rosario's, which was through Marco. Marco was the daytime host, a 22-year-old who treated the restaurant like it was the center of the universe because he had nothing else going on. He knew everything. He tracked everything. He had the kind of memory for gossip that some people had for sports statistics, effortless and total. Lena came in for her Saturday afternoon shift, and he was waiting for her at the host stand with an expression that meant something had happened, and he'd been holding it since morning. You're not going to believe it. She was already tired. She'd slept badly. "Marco, I haven't even put my apron on. The table from last night. The 3 people. The guy who didn't tip." She stopped walking. "Someone came in this morning," Marco said. "One of the investors. The silent partners. I wasn't supposed to hear, but I was right there." He pointed to a spot near the service window. They were talking to Chef Russo. "About the building." "What about the building?" "The lease." Apparently the building sold 3 weeks ago. New owner. And the new owner, Marco paused for effect, which she found annoying, came in last night for dinner. Lena looked at him. Your table, Marco said. The guy. The one you yelled at. I didn't yell at him. You told him he made you work for free. That's not yelling. That's a statement of fact. She felt something cold move through her anyway. What do you mean the new owner? I mean he owns the building, which means he basically owns the restaurant, because if he changes the lease terms, Chef Russo can't afford to stay here. And from what I heard this morning, he's been evaluating the whole block. Marco looked very satisfied with himself for knowing all of this. He sat in your section on purpose. He wanted to see how the place ran from a customer's perspective. She stared at him. So you kind of yelled at your boss, Marco said. Technically, he's not my boss. He owns the building your boss works in. She pulled her apron from her bag and tied it without looking at what she was doing. Her hands knew the motion well enough. When did you hear all of this? This morning. Around 10. Chef Russo looked upset, but not like scared upset. More like annoyed uncertain, which is different. She thought about the receipt, the 0 on the tip line. She thought about standing in the middle of the dining room with her face hot, telling a man in an expensive suit about her hourly wage. Okay, she said. Okay? Marco looked disappointed. That's your reaction? What do you want me to do, Marco? Panic? It happened. I said what I said. You could apologize. For what? Being accurate? He shrugged. For the optics. She walked past him toward the side station to start her opening duties. The restaurant was half lit at this hour, chairs still up on some of the tables, the smell of bleach from the overnight clean mixing with the olive oil someone was already heating in the kitchen. She knew this place, in every state. Early morning, last call. Dead Tuesday afternoon, slammed Saturday night. She'd worked here for 3 years. 3 years was a long time to work somewhere and still be calculating whether you could make rent. She thought about what Marco said all through her shift. It sat in the back of her mind, like a stone. She didn't let it change how she worked, because there was nothing to be done about it mid-shift. But it was there. Every table she smiled at, every order she called in, every time she refilled a water glass without being asked, she was aware of it. He owned the building. She had called him out in the middle of a restaurant, and he had smiled and said, "I apologize," and walked out like it was a perfectly normal evening. The shift ended at 9. She was pulling her jacket on in the back when Chef Russo called her name. He was a compact man in his late 50s, Greek-Italian, had owned Rosario's for 11 years. He had a temper like a gas burner, fast to ignite, quick to drop back down. She respected him because he was fair, and because he'd given her extra shifts without her asking when she'd had a hard winter 2 years ago. "Close the door," he said. She did. His office was small. A desk, a computer, a framed photo of his daughter at her quinceañera. He sat with his hands flat on the desk, which meant he was trying to be calm. "You spoke to a guest last night after they signed their check." "Yes, about the tip." "Yes," he breathed out slowly. "Lena, he left nothing, on a $2.40 bill. I was polite. I asked if there was a problem with the service, and then you explained your wage structure to him." She kept her expression steady. "I did. Do you know who he is?" "I found out this morning. He rubbed the side of his face. He called me today." Her stomach went tight. She kept still. "He didn't complain," Russo said, which was not what she'd been expecting. "He didn't ask for anything. He just called to introduce himself properly, because apparently he felt he should have done that last night instead of coming in anonymously." He paused. "He mentioned you by name." "What did he say?" He said Russo picked up a sticky note from his desk and read from it, which meant he'd written it down, which meant it had surprised him. He said, "Your server, Lena, gave me the most honest conversation I've had in a restaurant in years. I respect that. The room was very quiet. Then he said he'd be in touch about the lease, Russo added, which is either very good or very bad, and I don't know which yet. Lena sat with that for a second. The stone in the back of her mind didn't get smaller, exactly, but it shifted, changed shape. "What do you want me to do?" she asked. Russo looked at her. "Nothing, just keep working the way you work." He paused. "Whatever you said to him, it landed different than you probably think it did." She nodded. She left. She stood outside the back door in the cold for a moment, letting the night air hit her face. She still didn't know what any of it meant. She just knew it wasn't over. 3 days passed. She worked her shifts. She didn't hear anything more about the building or the lease or Damien, whoever he was. Marco asked her twice if she'd had any updates, and she said no both times, and eventually he moved on to a different story about one of the line cooks. Life continued being life. The alternator was still broken. She'd gotten an extension on the rent until the 20th, 3 extra days, which felt like mercy, but was just borrowed time. She picked up an extra lunch shift on Tuesday to make up the difference. On Wednesday evening, she was rolling silverware at the back table during the slow hour before the dinner rush when the hostess, a college student named Bree, came to find her. "There's someone asking for you specifically." Lena looked up. "A guest?" "He's at the bar. He asked if you were working tonight." She set down the fork and knife she was rolling. "What does he look like?" Bree's expression answered the question before her words did. Tall, dark hair. Suit, but not like a corporate suit. More like a suit he actually chose. Lena's stomach did something she ignored. "Tell him I'll be out in a minute." She washed her hands. She checked her reflection in the small mirror by the coat hooks, not because she was vain, but because she wanted to be prepared. She looked like what she was, someone who'd been working since 4. That was fine. He was sitting at the far end of the bar, not hunched over his phone this time. He was watching the room the way people watched rooms when they were actually paying attention to them, not performing patience, but genuinely observing. He had a glass of water in front of him, untouched. She walked over and stood across from him. "You asked for me." "I did." He didn't seem surprised to see her, which made sense since he'd asked for her. "Can you sit for a few minutes?" "I have a shift." "I spoke to Mr. Russo. He said it was fine." She looked at him for a second, then pulled out the bar stool and sat. The bartender, a guy named Pete, drifted to the other end and found something to do. Up close, in better light, she could see him more clearly. He was older than she'd thought the other night. Not old, but somewhere in his mid-30s. There was something in his face that had been through things. Not dramatic things necessarily, just the regular kind of accumulation. "I should have introduced myself properly when I was here," he said. "My name is Damien Voss. Lena Marsh." "I know." He said it without arrogance, just fact. "I looked into the staff before I came in Friday. It's something I do when I'm assessing a property. Assessing, evaluating the whole picture, the physical space, the lease structure, the financials," and he paused slightly, "the people." She kept her face still. "And how did we do?" "Better than the financials suggest." He turned the water glass slowly with one hand. "The place is under-leveraged. The rent's been below market for years, which is why it survived, but the new rate I'd be within my rights to charge would likely end it." He said it without cruelty, just plainly, and somehow that made it easier to hear than if he'd tried to soften it. "Are you going to?" she asked. "I haven't decided." He looked at her directly. "I came back because of what you said Friday. I said a lot of things Friday. You said tips aren't extra. They're the wage." He paused. "I know that. I've always known it. I grew up around people who lived on tips. I don't know why I went back to not tipping when I was old enough to not have to think about money. Habit, maybe, or some way of telling myself I was separate from the system. He said it evenly, like he was reporting something he'd observed about himself without particular pride or shame. It was such a strange thing to admit to a stranger that she didn't know how to respond to it immediately. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked. "Because you were honest with me when you didn't have to be, and it cost you something to do it." He put the water glass down, and I've been thinking about it for 3 days. The dinner rush was starting to build. She could hear the kitchen coming alive behind the wall. In an hour, this bar would be full and she'd be moving fast. "What do you want, Mr. Voss? I want to offer you something." He reached into his jacket and put a card on the bar between them. "Not the restaurant. Something separate. I'm opening a new space next year. Hospitality, but different. More of a members-based club. High service. Small scale. I need someone to help design the service experience. Not manage it. Design it. What it feels like for the guest from the moment they walk in." She looked at the card. She didn't pick it up. "I'm a waitress," she said. "You're someone who understands service from the inside in a way that most consultants I've met don't." He said it without flattery, the same way he said everything. "You understand what it costs the person delivering it. That's rare." She looked up at him. "And the restaurant? Rosario's?" Something crossed his face. "I'm working through the numbers. I haven't made a decision. But you might raise the rent." "I might." She appreciated that he didn't lie to her. She also hated it. "I need to think about it," she said. "Of course." He stood, which surprised her. She'd expected more of a push. "My cell is on the card. Take as long as you need." He put on his jacket. He reached into his wallet and set something on the bar next to the card. She looked down. It was cash. She couldn't see the amount without looking directly at it, and she wasn't going to do that while he was still standing there. "Retroactive," he said simply. And then he left. Pete materialized at her elbow approximately 4 seconds later. "I wasn't eavesdropping," Pete said, in a tone that meant he absolutely was. But what was that? Lena picked up the cash, counted it without letting her expression change. $500. She put it in her apron pocket and picked up his business card and looked at it for a moment. "I have no idea," she said honestly. Then she went to work. She didn't call that week. She thought about it. She took the card out twice and looked at it. The second time she looked up his name and spent 40 minutes going down a quiet rabbit hole of business articles and property records and one profile piece from a magazine she'd never heard of. Damien Voss, 37, had bought his first building at 23 with money he'd made, doing something in logistics that the article explained, but that she couldn't quite follow. Now he owned 11 properties across 3 cities, not flashy ones, not towers with his name on them, but older buildings in transitional neighborhoods. The article called his approach patient capital, which apparently meant he bought things other people thought were too much trouble and waited. She found one photo of him that wasn't taken at a business event. He was standing outside a building in what looked like winter, hands in his pockets, looking at something outside the frame. He looked the same way he'd looked at the bar. Present. Paying attention. She put her phone down and didn't call. The reason she didn't call wasn't because she wasn't interested. It was because she didn't trust the shape of it. Men with money who decided they liked you were a specific category of problem. She'd been inside that category before, not with anyone this wealthy, but the pattern was familiar enough. The attention that felt like recognition until you realized it was collection. Until you understood that what he found interesting about you was interesting to him the way an unusual object was interesting. Something to have. She didn't know yet if Damien Voss was that kind of person. She didn't know him at all. But she was 26, and she'd been reading people across tables for 3 years, and she knew that not knowing was reason enough to wait. What she didn't expect was to run into him again before she'd decided anything. Saturday afternoon. She was off. She was at the hardware store 2 blocks from her apartment, trying to find the right size bolt for a cabinet hinge she'd been meaning to fix for 2 months. It was not a glamorous moment. She was wearing old jeans and a flannel shirt she'd had since college, and her hair was pulled back without any particular intention. He was in the same aisle. He was holding a package of weather stripping and looking at it with the same focused attention he seemed to give everything. He noticed her at about the same moment she noticed him, and they both stopped. "This is strange," she said. "I have a building 4 blocks from here," he said. "I come in here more than is probably reasonable. I live 2 blocks away." He looked at the bolt in her hand. "What's broken?" "Cabinet hinge." "Which type of cabinet?" She showed him the bolt. He looked at it for a second, then moved 2 steps down the aisle and pulled a different package off the hook and handed it to her. "That one won't hold. The thread's too fine. You want something with a coarser pitch." She took the package. He was right. She could see it immediately. "Thank you." Sure, he didn't try to extend it. He turned back to the weather stripping. She stood there for a second. Then she said, "I read about you." He glanced at her. "Anything interesting?" "Patient capital." A small smile. That's a generous framing for someone who's mostly just slow to decide things. She leaned against the shelf. "Why that building?" "Our building, I mean. What made you want it?" He considered the question seriously, which she was starting to understand was just how he did things. The block is changing slowly. The buildings on it are old and undervalued but structurally solid. In 5 years, the area will look different. But, he paused, there's also something about properties that have been running continuously for a long time. Rosario's has been there 11 years. The bookstore 2 doors down has been there 22. Something's working. I want to understand what before I touch it. Before you change the rent. Before I do anything. She looked at him. The people who work in those buildings aren't investment variables. No. He didn't argue it or qualify it. Just agreed. But they're affected by what you decide. Yes, she was quiet for a moment. That's a lot of weight to carry. It is. He said it simply, without performing the burden of it. She turned the bolt package over in her hands. "I haven't called." "I noticed. I wasn't sure if the offer was real or if it was something else." He looked at her directly. "It was real. It is real. But I also understand why it wouldn't look that way from where you're standing." He said it without defensiveness. "I walked into your restaurant anonymously to evaluate the place. I didn't tip you. You called me on it, and 3 days later I'm back with a job offer. That's a strange sequence. It is a strange sequence. I can give you references," he said. "People I've worked with. People who aren't on my payroll who can tell you what my working style is actually like, if that would help." She hadn't expected that either. She nodded slowly. That would help. He took out his phone and texted her 2 names and numbers right there in the aisle of the hardware store. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. "Take your time," he said again. And then, genuinely, "How's the rest of your Saturday going? I'm off today." Right. He looked almost briefly uncertain for the first time, which was interesting on his face. "Enjoy your Saturday then." He paid for the weather stripping. She paid for the bolt. They walked out in the same direction and then split off at the corner without making anything of it. She fixed the cabinet hinge that afternoon. It took 10 minutes. She sat on the kitchen floor afterward with her back against the cabinet and looked at the 2 names on her phone. She called the first one. A woman named Carolyn Park, who turned out to be a restaurant owner in another city who'd sold her building to Voss 4 years ago. Lena had expected the call to be formal, a character reference. Instead, Carolyn laughed when she explained who she was and said, Oh, he finally found someone to help him with the new place? Good. He's been looking for the right person for a year. He's impossible to work with if you need a lot of direction. But if you're someone who knows what they're doing and wants to be left alone to do it, he's actually great. Lena sat with that for a moment. He's not, she tried to figure out how to ask what she actually wanted to ask. He's not someone who, if you're asking whether he's the kind of man who makes an offer to a woman because he likes the way she looks, Carolyn said, the answer is no. He's annoyingly literal. He saw something in your work, and he wants that thing. It's not complicated with him. It's almost frustrating how uncomplicated it is. Lena thanked her and hung up. She sat on the kitchen floor for a while longer. Then she picked up her phone and called the second name. The second name was a man named Russell Okafor, who answered on the second ring and turned out to be a former operations director who'd left Voss's company 2 years ago to start something of his own. She'd expected the reference to be clean, the way references always were. People said good things because they'd been asked to. Russell wasn't like that. He's not easy, he said, almost immediately. I want to be honest with you, because whoever you are, you deserve an honest picture. He's demanding in a specific way. He doesn't ask for a lot of your time, and he doesn't micromanage. But when he does need something from you, he needs it fully. He doesn't want halfway. He doesn't want done for now. What made you leave? A pause. I wanted to build something myself. It wasn't about him. The work was good. The money was good. He was fair. Another pause. Actually, he was more than fair. When I left, he gave me 6 months of runway without me asking. Said he wanted the transition to go well for me. That's not how most people operate. She thanked him and sat with both calls for a while. Then she opened the magazine profile again and read the part she'd skimmed before, the section near the end. The writer had asked him what he looked for when he bought a property. He'd said, something that's been doing the work quietly without anyone paying attention. Those are the things worth protecting. She read it twice. Then, she texted him, she said, I spoke to both references. I'd like to hear more about the project if you're still interested. He replied in 4 minutes. He said yes. When works for you? She said, Wednesday evening. He said, I'll send you an address. She put the phone down and felt something shift in her chest. Not big, not dramatic, just a slight rearrangement of the things she'd been holding tightly. Wednesday came. The address he sent was not a restaurant. It was a building in a neighborhood she didn't know well, just past the point where things got interesting and before they got expensive. The building was old brick, 4 stories, corner lot. There was scaffolding on one side that looked new. She stood on the sidewalk looking at it. He came out the front door when he saw her, which meant he'd been watching for her. He was dressed more casually than she'd seen him before. Dark jeans, a dark jacket, no tie. He still looked like someone who'd walked out of a controlled environment, but the specific kind of controlled was different. Less office, more his own. What do you think? He asked, looking up at the building. I don't know yet. She looked at the facade. The windows were tall, the original glass replaced with something newer, but not badly done. How long have you had it? 8 months. It was a warehouse conversion before. Someone started the renovation and ran out of money. He opened the door. Come see. Inside was raw and clean at the same time. Concrete floors, high ceilings, exposed metal beams. The bones of whatever it was going to be were visible without the finished skin yet. She could see how the space could move, where the light would fall at different hours. He walked her through it. He explained what was planned where. Ground floor for gathering, a kind of extended lobby that felt like a room rather than an entrance. Second floor for the actual club space, 20 members maximum at any one time. Food and drink, but slow and deliberate. Third floor private. Fourth, undecided, she asked questions. Real ones, not polite ones. She asked about noise bleed between floors. She asked about the service corridor and whether it was wide enough to move efficiently without crossing the guest path. She asked about the kitchen size relative to the number of covers they were imagining, and whether the ventilation had been thought through for the menu type. He answered the ones he knew, and said directly when he didn't have an answer yet. He had a notebook. He was writing things down. After an hour, they sat on the concrete floor of the second level with their backs against the wall, looking out at the space. It was the kind of thing that might look strange from outside. A man in a nice jacket, and a woman who waitressed sitting on the floor of an empty room. But inside it didn't feel strange at all. "Why a members club?" she asked. "Because I want to build something where the relationship with the guest is ongoing," he said, "not transactional. The problem with most restaurants is that every night starts from zero. You don't know who's coming. They don't know what to expect from you. The good ones build something anyway, but it takes years." He paused. "I want to start with the relationship already in place." She thought about that. That only works if you're selective in the right way, if your members are people who value the relationship too, not people who want access. "Yes, how do you tell the difference?" He thought for a moment. "I'm not sure yet. That's part of what I need help figuring out." She looked at the space. The light was going. The city outside made its constant low sound. "I'm not a consultant," she said. "I don't have credentials for something like this. I know. I also still have a job. I can't just leave. I'm not asking you to leave yet." He looked at her. "I'm asking you to think about it with me for a while. See if it's something you want to build. If it is, we figure out the rest." She turned that over carefully. It was the kind of offer that was hard to find the catch in, which made her look harder. "What happens if it doesn't work out?" she asked. "Between the project and me." "You go back to what you were doing and I find someone else." He said it without drama. "I don't make people feel trapped. That's not useful to either person." She nodded slowly. Outside, the streetlights had started to come on. Through the tall windows, she could see the block slowly shifting from day into evening. "Okay," she said. "Okay? I'll think about it with you, for now." He nodded. He didn't smile the large kind of smile that would have made her feel like she'd just agreed to more than she meant to. He just nodded, like she'd said something that made sense. They left together and split at the corner again. She took the bus home. The city moved past the windows in its usual way. She thought about the building and the concrete floors and the notebook and the questions she'd asked that she hadn't expected to ask. She thought about the way he'd written things down. She thought about 3 years of rolling silverware and calculating percentages. She thought, maybe. She didn't quit her job at Rosario's. Not yet, not even close. She just started doing 2 things at once, which was not new for her. She'd been doing 2 things at once for most of her adult life. 3 nights a week at the restaurant. Wednesday evenings at the building with Damien. She started calling it the building in her head, and then out loud, and eventually he started calling it that too, which she found privately amusing. That a man who dealt in properties all day would end up adopting her placeholder name for the most important one. The Wednesdays had a specific rhythm. She'd arrive. He'd already be there. Sometimes he was in the middle of a call, and he'd hold up one finger and finish it. Never more than a few minutes. He was efficient with his time in a way that felt like respect rather than urgency. They worked through the building, floor by floor. She had thoughts. A lot of thoughts, it turned out. She'd been storing observations about hospitality for 3 years without anywhere to put them. What made a guest feel seen without feeling watched? The difference between attentive service and surveillance service. How the pace of a meal could be managed without the guest ever noticing they were being managed. The things a room communicated before a single person spoke. He listened the way she was starting to understand he did everything. Completely, She wasn't used to being listened to that completely. It was slightly disorienting. One evening she arrived, and he was sitting at a folding table he'd set up in the middle of the second floor, a spread of papers around him, and he looked up and said, "I had a new idea about the member intake process, and I want to know if it's wrong." She sat down, and he explained it. It was partly right, and partly completely impractical, and she told him both. He crossed out the impractical part, without ceremony. "How do you know it's impractical?" he asked. "Because I've watched people be made to feel evaluated. It makes them contract, not open. You want them to feel like they're being invited, not interviewed." He looked at the paper. "How do you do that?" "You tell them something about the place first. Before you ask them anything, you make them feel like the relationship goes both ways from the start." He wrote that down. She wasn't sure exactly when she stopped watching the situation for the catch and started just being inside it. It wasn't one moment. It was the accumulation of small things. The way he never made her feel like she owed him something for the opportunity. The way he disagreed with her sometimes, directly and without softening it, which she found more respectful than if he'd agreed with everything. The way he brought coffee without asking, always the same order after the first time she'd mentioned it, without making a thing of it. She started noticing things about him that were not professional. The way he got quieter when he was most interested in something, like the energy that would have gone into words, was being diverted. The way he stood in the building sometimes when he thought she wasn't looking, just standing still, looking up, like he was having a conversation with the space. She noticed. She was noticing. She filed it. She didn't act on it. At the restaurant, things were in suspension. The lease question was still unresolved. Chef Russo didn't bring it up, but she could see it on him. The staff had mostly heard something was happening, but the details were vague enough that it hadn't become real fear yet, just background noise. She felt complicated about being inside both sides of it. On a Thursday night after a long shift, she told Marco the basic shape of what was happening. Not everything, but enough. He stared at her. "You're working with the guy who might end the restaurant. I'm consulting on a separate project. It has nothing to do with Rosario's. But you know him." "I've gotten to know him, yes." Marco was quiet for a second, which was unusual. "Is he going to raise the rent?" "I don't know. I've asked. He says he hasn't decided." "Do you believe him?" She thought about it honestly. Yes, why? Because he's not someone who says things he doesn't mean. If he'd decided, he'd say he'd decided. Marco looked at her for a long time with the expression he had when he was recalibrating something. "You like him?" "I work with him." "That's not what I said." She picked up her bag and jacket. "Good night, Marco." She thought about it on the bus home. Whether Marco was right. Whether she was being careful enough or too careful, or careful about the wrong things. She thought about the evening a week earlier when they'd been going over the layout of the service corridor, and they'd needed to physically walk through it to check the width, and they'd ended up shoulder to shoulder in a tight space, and neither of them had moved away faster than necessary. She'd been very aware of the fact of him in that moment, not in a way she could easily categorize. She thought about how she'd put it in a specific drawer in her mind, and closed the drawer. The bus stopped. She got off. The night air was cold and clean. She stood outside her building for a minute before going in. Above the city, the sky was doing something quiet and dark blue. She could see a few stars, which was unusual. She thought about 3 years ago when she'd moved to this city with 2 boxes and a duvet and no plan except that she needed to be somewhere different. She'd gotten the job at Rosario's within a week, which felt like luck. She'd stayed because it paid, and because Chef Russo was decent, and because she hadn't figured out what came next. She was still waiting to figure out what came next. Maybe this was it. Maybe it was something else. She didn't know yet. She went inside. She made tea. She sat at the kitchen table and opened her notebook, the one she'd started bringing to the Wednesday sessions, and looked at the pages she'd filled. Ideas, questions, sketches of layouts, fragments of thoughts about service and atmosphere, and the texture of experience. She read through them for a while. They were good. Better than she'd expected, reading them back. She closed the notebook and finished her tea and went to bed. She didn't dream about anything particular. She just slept, which she needed. The thing she hadn't expected about working with Damien was how much he worked. She'd had a quiet assumption, not fully formed, that someone who owned 11 buildings dealt mostly in decisions, the big ones, the sweeping ones, that the actual labor happened elsewhere, managed by other people. She'd been wrong. He worked in the specifics. He knew the floor plan dimensions in the building by memory, room by room. He'd read 3 books on hospitality design in the 2 months he'd owned the place, and could reference specific chapters. He had a relationship with the contractor that involved detailed daily conversations about materials and timing and costs. He knew which suppliers his competitors used, and why certain ones were better for certain applications. It changed how she saw the money. It wasn't that he didn't have it. He clearly did. It was that he didn't use it as a substitute for knowing things. He used it to make the things he already knew possible. She respected that. On a Wednesday in early December, she arrived to find him in conversation with a woman she didn't recognize, both of them standing in front of a large printed layout tacked to the wall. He introduced her as Miriam, the interior architect. Miriam was in her 50s, compact, wore paint-stained jeans that seemed intentional rather than careless. Damien says, "You've been working through the service experience," Miriam said. "We have," Lena said. "I have some questions for you then." Miriam pulled a pen from behind her ear, the passage between the kitchen prep area and the main floor. He wants it to disappear. Operationally, what does disappearing mean to you? Because it means something different to me. It was the most direct anyone had spoken to her in a professional context in a long time. She felt herself straighten slightly. Disappearing means the guest never sees a harried face. They never see someone carrying something awkward. They never hear a kitchen sound at the wrong moment. She pointed at the layout. The entry to the passage needs to be angled away from the primary sightlines of the seating area, and it needs to be wide enough that 2 people can pass without one having to stop and turn sideways. Miriam looked at the layout. Made a mark. That adds 18 inches to this wall. I know. Miriam looked at Damien. She's right. She made the mark bigger. Lena stood there in the conversation that followed, which got technical in ways she couldn't always follow, but she contributed when she could, and listened carefully when she couldn't. At the end of an hour, Miriam rolled up her papers and said to Lena, "You should have been doing this 10 years ago." She didn't know what to say to that. She said thank you. After Miriam left, she and Damien stood looking at the layout in silence for a moment. "She doesn't say that to people," he said. "Say what?" "That they should have been doing something." He looked at the layout. She spent 30 years watching people do jobs they're wrong for. She notices when someone is right for something. Lena looked at the layout too. Her mark was there in pencil, 18 inches. The passage widened. Something that would matter every service for the life of the building. Something she'd put there. She felt a specific kind of feeling that was harder to name than happiness. More like alignment. Like a gear that had been spinning without catching, had finally found something to turn against. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Yes. The night you came into Rosario's. You said you came in to evaluate the property." "Yes. But you sat in my section specifically." "Marco told me you asked the host." He was quiet for a moment. "I read through the staff when I research a property. Reviews sometimes mention people by name. I'd seen your name mentioned several times." "What did they say?" "Things like, the service was warm but not intrusive. Things like, She remembered what we'd ordered the last time without being asked. One person said she was the reason they kept coming back. He looked at the layout. Those are specific observations, not vague compliments. I wanted to see what they were describing. She processed that. And the not tipping? A pause. He seemed to think about whether to answer. It was a test. Not of your performance, of your reaction. I wanted to see what you'd do when you were treated incorrectly by someone who had power over your situation. She looked at him. That's a strange way to evaluate a person. Yes, he didn't defend it. It was also wrong. What you said to me was right. I shouldn't have set up a situation where you had to absorb something unfair in order for me to observe you. She held that. Why are you telling me this now? Because you deserve to know the full story of that evening, and because he paused, which he almost never did. Because I want the working relationship between us to be honest, and I've been carrying an incomplete version of events. She looked at him for a long time. He held the look without flinching or deflecting. What would you have done, she said slowly, if I had just said there's no problem with the service and let you leave? Found someone else. He said it simply, because that would have meant you weren't the person those reviews described, that you'd learn to swallow things instead of address them. She turned back to the layout. The pencil mark, 18 inches. I don't know whether to be annoyed by that or not, she said. You can be both, he said. It's fair. She was, she realized. Both, annoyed at the method and also, underneath it, understanding the logic of it, which was its own specific thing to feel about a person. She stayed later than usual that evening. They went over the second floor layout in full, and she raised 4 things she'd been thinking about for a week, and he engaged with each one seriously. When she finally left the building, the city was cold and bright, and she walked 3 blocks before getting the bus, just to have the air. He texted her when she was halfway home. It said, "Thank you for tonight." The 18 inches was the right call. She looked at the text for a moment on the dark bus. She wrote back, "I know." Then she put her phone in her pocket and looked out the window at the city moving past. Dark buildings and lit windows and all the lives happening behind them, and she thought that something was shifting. She couldn't see the shape of it yet, but she could feel the movement. December moved through in the way Decembers did, too fast and too full. The restaurant ran hot. Holiday parties, extended menus, guests who were more impatient because they were out of their routine and wanted everything to feel like celebration on demand. She worked it well. She was good in the holiday rush in a way that some people weren't. She could hold multiple threads without dropping any of them. She could read the table and know when to speed things up and when to let it breathe. Chef Russo told her she was his best closer, which she'd heard before, but still felt like something. The Wednesday evenings continued. They were moving into a phase of the project that was less conceptual and more concrete material selections. Timeline planning. The first draft of what the member experience would actually look like on paper. She was writing things now, not just thinking them. Actual documents. Service philosophy. Guest journey mapping, that was the term she'd learned from Miriam. What the experience felt like minute by minute. She found she had a lot to say. On the 3rd Wednesday of December, he asked her to look over a draft contract. Not to sign it, just to read it and tell him if anything seemed off. She read it at the kitchen table that night. It was a consulting agreement. Her name, her role, the project. The rate was written on the 4th page, and she read the number and then read it again. It was more than she made in 2 months at the restaurant. She sat with that for a while. She wasn't sure what she'd expected. More than she was making currently, yes, but this was a specific number. It had weight. She emailed him the next morning with 3 questions about the contract, none of them about the rate. He answered all 3 by afternoon. She signed it and scanned it and sent it back. He replied, "Good," See you Wednesday." She went to her Friday shift at Rosario's and served 14 tables, and came home and sat at the kitchen table and thought about the fact that she'd just signed a contract that meant she was, officially, something other than a waitress. Not a waitress, she was still that. But also this other thing. She didn't know how she felt about it. Good, yes, but also slightly unmoored, the way it felt when something you'd been moving toward finally became solid, and you realized you'd been using the moving as a way to not be still. She called her mother that night, which she didn't do as often as she should. Her mother was in a different city, worked at a community college, had a voice that made Lena feel immediately like she was 15 again. She told her mother the basic shape of things, not every detail, just enough. Her mother was quiet for a moment after. Then she said, "You went after him for not tipping?" "I didn't go after him. I asked if there was a problem with the service." "In front of the whole restaurant?" He was the last table. The place was mostly empty. Another pause. "Is he handsome?" "Mom, I'm asking. That's not relevant." "It's slightly relevant," her mother said. "It's relevant to the full picture." Lena looked at the ceiling. "He's fine." Her mother made a sound that meant she was smiling. "You always say fine when you mean more than fine. I'm working with him on a project. It's professional." Okay, her mother didn't push it. She knew when to let things land. That was something Lena had learned from her, actually, when to push and when to wait. They talked for another hour about other things. When she hung up, the room was quiet. She thought about what her mother had said. Not the handsome question. The other thing. The shape of the story she'd told. She'd started with the argument. The confrontation at table 4. The 0 on the tip line. She'd started there because that's where it started. But also, she realized, because it was the part of the story she understood completely. Her own action, her own risk, her own words. The part that came after was murkier. Someone else's decisions, someone else's recognition. It was harder to own that part. To sit with being seen and chosen without finding a reason to dismiss it. She was working on that. In the second week of January, she arrived at the building on a Wednesday, and something was different immediately. She wasn't sure what it was. Not the building. The building was the same. It was him. He was standing at the window looking out at the street, and when he turned around, she could see something behind his usual stillness that was less settled. "Everything okay?" she said. "I had a meeting today that didn't go how I expected." She sat down on the folding chairs they'd put in the second floor by now, the makeshift meeting setup that had evolved over months. "What kind of meeting?" "There's a group interested in partnering on this project. Capital injection. They'd come in as minority partners. It would accelerate everything by about 18 months. But they have ideas about what the space should be. Different ideas than we've been developing." She noticed the we. She let it sit. "What do they want?" she asked. "More volume. More visibility. They think the small-scale exclusive model is too limited. They want to open the membership up, add an events component, lean into the status aspect." She thought about that. "That's a different project." "Yes, is it a better one?" He looked at her. "No, but it's a faster one, and the numbers are better on paper in the short term." She leaned back. "What are you going to do?" He was quiet. "I'm thinking, you built this idea on a specific principle, that the relationship was more important than the scale." She paused. "If you change that for the money, you might end up with a project that succeeds financially and fails at the thing that made it worth building." He looked at her for a long time. "Say that again," he said quietly. "Which part?" "All of it." She said it again, more slowly. He listened with his whole face, the way he did. "I needed to hear that from someone other than myself," he said. "Then, you already knew it." Knowing it alone and hearing it out loud are different things. He looked at the layout on the wall. I'm going to pass on the partnership. She nodded. She didn't say good choice or congratulate herself. It wasn't her choice to make. But she was glad. He declined the partnership by the end of that week. She found out not because he told her immediately, but because a week later he mentioned it in passing while they were going over vendor timelines, and the way he mentioned it told her he'd been thinking about it since the decision, sitting with it, checking it. Do you regret it? She asked. No. He didn't hesitate. But I notice I keep re-examining the decision, which is different from regretting it. Why do you think that is? Because the money would have been easier, he said plainly. And I'm trained to respond to easier. She thought about that for a moment. About what it meant to know something was wrong for you and still feel the pull of it. She understood that particular strain of effort. She'd exercised it in her own life often enough. Easier isn't always wrong, she said. No, but in this case, it was. He looked at the wall. In this case, it would have meant building something for someone else's idea of what it should be. And I would have funded it, managed it, put my name on it, and it wouldn't have been the thing. She understood what he meant by the thing. They'd been in conversation about it long enough that she understood. January moved toward February. The construction phase was picking up speed now. There were workers in the building regularly, which changed the texture of the Wednesday evenings. More noise, more interruption, more decisions that had to be made on the spot. She found she was good at on the spot, better, maybe, than at the longer arc of planning. One evening she arrived and found Miriam in heated disagreement with the contractor about a wall on the 3rd floor that was apparently load-bearing in a way that complicated the floor plan. She stood in the doorway, watching them for a moment. Then, she stepped in and asked 2 questions that helped them figure out a third option neither had considered. Miriam looked at her afterward and said, "Where have you been all my career?" "Rosario's on 5th, Lena said. Miriam laughed. It was a good laugh. She told Damien about it later that evening while they were closing up. He smiled, the real kind, not the controlled one. She'd learned to tell the difference. Miriam doesn't laugh easily, he said. I noticed. You have that effect. He said it without looking at her, adjusting something on the table matter of fact. People relax around you. They say things they wouldn't otherwise say. She didn't know what to do with that immediately. Is that a professional observation? He looked at her then. Directly, no. The room was suddenly different. Not dramatically, not with any action, just the words still in the air. She held his gaze. Damien, I know, he said. It's not the right time, or the right context, or probably either of those things. He looked away first. I'm not trying to complicate what we're building here. Okay, she said. But I wanted to be honest. Since we're in the habit. She thought about what he'd said on the first real evening here. That he wanted the working relationship to be honest. That he'd told her about the test because she deserved to know the full story. She stood in the building with its raw walls and the sounds of the city outside and thought about honesty and what it cost and what it was worth. I'm not unaware of it, she said carefully. What you just said. I'm not going to pretend I don't understand what you mean. He looked at her. But I also need the project to be the project, she said. Not a context for something else. Because what we're building here matters to me separately. I know that, he said. I wouldn't want it any other way. Good, she picked up her bag. Then, we're fine. She left. She walked the 3 blocks to the bus in the cold, and she let herself feel the full weight of the conversation, which she'd been managing carefully for several months now. She was not indifferent to him. She'd been not indifferent for a while. That was just a fact she'd been holding at arm's length. She also meant what she'd said. The project mattered to her. The work she was doing was the best work she'd done. She wasn't going to fold it into something romantic and risk losing the clarity of it, but she also knew that the distance she was keeping required effort, and that effort was becoming a constant low hum. She sat on the bus and looked at her reflection in the dark window, a woman on a bus at night, going home from somewhere that was starting to feel like hers. She thought about 3 years ago. 2 boxes and a duvet. She thought about the iced tea on her apron and the 0 on the tip line, and how everything since had come from the fact that she'd been too tired to swallow one more thing. She thought that was maybe the truest version of her story. Not that she'd been brave, not that she'd done the right thing, just that she'd been tired and honest at the exact right moment, and the world had shifted. She thought that was enough. Better than a plan. More reliable than strategy. Just the truth. Said out loud. To the right person. At the right time. She got off the bus. The night was cold and clear. She could see the building from 2 blocks away. The scaffolding lit up. Someone still working. The city hummed around it. She went home. In February, she gave her notice at Rosario's. She'd waited longer than she needed to, she knew. Partly because of the loyalty. Partly because of the uncertainty. Some part of her still keeping a hand on the familiar thing while testing the new ground with her foot. But the contract was signed. The project was real. The work was too much to do well on 3 evenings a week. She told Chef Russo on a Tuesday morning, early, before the lunch prep started. She sat down in his office with the door closed and told him the truth in plain language. He listened. He didn't look surprised. "I've been watching you work on something," he said. "You've had that look for a few months now." "What look?" "The one people get when they've found the next thing." He folded his hands on the desk. "The building. Voss's project." She nodded. He was quiet for a moment. He made a decision about the lease. She waited. "He's keeping the rent at the current rate for 3 more years." Russo looked at his desk, with a cap on increases after that. He had his lawyers drafted last month. He looked up at her. "He didn't mention it to you?" She thought about it. He hadn't. She'd been inside both worlds for months, and he'd kept that separate. She understood why. He hadn't wanted the professional relationship to carry the weight of obligation or gratitude. He'd made the decision separately and let it be separate. She felt something complicated move through her. Respect, she thought, and the something else she'd been keeping in its own drawer. "No," she said. He didn't mention it. Russo studied her. "He's a different kind of person than I expected when I heard the building had sold." "Yes," she said. "He is." She worked her last 2 weeks fully. She trained the newer server, a young man named Danny, who was good and just needed someone to tell him what he was doing right as clearly as what he was doing wrong. She made sure her regulars knew she was leaving without making it into a big thing. A few of them said they'd miss her specifically, by name, which she received without deflecting. On her last night, Marco brought a small cake from the bakery 2 doors down, with her name written on it in uneven frosting. The whole closing staff ate it standing in the kitchen at 11:30, and someone told a story about the time Lena had handled a table of 12 grad students at the end of a Saturday night without losing her patience once, and everyone laughed. She laughed too. She felt the smallness of it and the bigness of it at the same time. She took the bus home for the last time on that route. She sat in her usual seat and looked at the city going past. In the morning she woke up, and there was nowhere to be until Wednesday. She made coffee and sat at the table with her notebook open. She wrote for 2 hours. Thoughts about the member intake process she'd been turning over for weeks. A new idea about how the food offering could double as an extension of the welcome. Not just sustenance, but information about what kind of place this was. She filled 12 pages. When she arrived at the building on Wednesday, Damien was already there with Miriam and the contractor, and 2 people she hadn't met before. A lighting designer, and someone from a catering consultancy he was considering. She walked into the room, and it was full, and people were talking, and he looked up when she came in. "There she is," Miriam said. "We've been waiting for you to weigh in on the lighting brief." She set down her bag and walked to the table and looked at the brief and started asking questions. That was how it felt, like walking into a room where she was expected, where her arrival changed the shape of the conversation. She stayed until 9. The others cleared out around 7. She and Damien were the last two as usual, standing in the second-floor space with the day's work spread out on the table. "You quit," he said. "I gave notice 2 weeks ago." She looked at him. "You knew." "Russo mentioned it." He paused. "I wanted you to do it on your own timeline." "I did." He nodded. He picked up a paper from the table and set it down again. "How does it feel?" She thought about it genuinely. "Strange. Like standing in a room I've been walking toward for a long time, and now I'm in it, and I have to figure out what to do inside it instead of just moving toward it." He looked at her with that full attention. "That's exactly what it feels like." "You felt it? Every major decision." He paused. "The hard part is resisting the urge to immediately find the next horizon, to let yourself be in the thing instead of just approaching it." She looked at the space around them. The walls that had been raw concrete for months were starting to have finishes now. The floor was being laid. The shape of what it would be was becoming visible in the bones. "It's beautiful," she said, not performing, just saying it. "It is." He was looking at it too, because of a lot of things, including you. She let that sit. She didn't deflect it. "I've been thinking," she said slowly, "about what you said in January." He was still. "Waiting, I said I needed the project to be the project," she said. "That was true. It still is true." She looked at him, "But I also think I was using it as a way to not deal with the other thing." He held her gaze. "I'm not saying I know what the other thing is," she said. "I don't. I think we'd have to find out. And I think finding out is complicated when we're also building something together." "It is complicated," he said. "But I think pretending it isn't there is its own complication." She paused. "And I'd rather deal with real things." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "So would I." The building was quiet around them. The city hummed outside. The lights they'd argued over and decided on together were installed now, not lit yet but visible, tracing the shape of what evenings would feel like when the space was alive. She thought about the night she'd stood in a nearly empty restaurant, holding a receipt with a 0 on it. How far from here that felt. How directly it had led here. "We should probably not make any decisions tonight," she said. "Agreed," he said. "But talking about it was the right thing." "I know." They left together. They stood on the sidewalk outside the building in the cold, and she could see him trying to figure out the right way to end the evening. And it was, she realized, the first time she'd seen him uncertain in a way that wasn't about work. The first time he'd been in unfamiliar territory, the same way she'd been in unfamiliar territory for months. She found it unexpectedly studying, that they were both in it. "Good night, Damien," she said. "Good night, Lena." She walked toward the bus stop. After half a block, she heard him say her name. She turned. "Thank you," he said, for saying it out loud. She looked at him across the dark street, his hands in his pockets, the building behind him with its scaffolding and its lights and its becoming. "We're in the habit," she said. Then she turned and kept walking, and the city received her as it always did, in its ordinary, indifferent, beautiful way. March came in cold, and then turned warm too fast, the way it sometimes did. 1 week still needing a heavy coat, and the next week everyone slightly confused, pulling out wrong season clothes and catching each other's eyes on the street as if to confirm that yes, this was real. Winter was actually ending. The building was in its final stretch. There was a specific energy to nearly done, that was different from the sustained energy of building. More tense, more fragile. Every remaining decision felt final. The lighting was installed and tested. The kitchen equipment was in. The service corridor was exactly as wide as she'd specified, which she walked through twice and said nothing about out loud, but felt quietly in her chest. Members were being considered. She'd built the intake framework over the winter, the process that felt like invitation rather than evaluation. Damien had sent it out to 12 prospective members with a letter he'd written and asked her to review. She'd changed 3 sentences, not because they were wrong, but because 2 of them were too formal for what the space was becoming, and 1 of them undersold it. He'd accepted all 3 changes without discussion. They had not had another conversation like the one in January. What they'd had instead was a shift in the texture of things. Less careful. Slightly more direct. She would say things she might have held back before. He would look at her sometimes for a fraction of a second longer than necessary before responding, and she'd begun to stop cataloging that look and just receive it. Nothing had been defined. She was fine with that. Definitions had a way of collapsing the thing they named. On the second Saturday of March, she arrived at the building not for a Wednesday session, but because there was a final walkthrough with the full team. Miriam, the contractor. The lighting designer. 2 members of the catering consultancy. Her and Damien. They moved through the space, floor by floor. On the ground floor, Miriam pointed out something about the entry threshold, the specific material transition that happened the moment you stepped inside, and the way it communicated arrival without announcing it. She'd been talking about this for months. Now, it was real and underfoot, and it did exactly what she'd said it would do. On the second floor, they walked through a service cycle that the catering consultant had choreographed with 2 of his team members standing in as guests. It was rough, but the underlying logic was right. Lena made 2 notes. On the 3rd floor, they stood and looked at what the private space had become. Smaller than anything else in the building. A room with 4 chairs and a table and a single window that looked onto a courtyard that couldn't be seen from the street. It was the quietest room she'd been in for months. Everyone was talking around her. She stood at the window and looked at the courtyard, the small square of sky above it. Damien came and stood beside her. "You're quiet," he said. "It's good," she said. She wasn't sure she had better words for it. It's what it was supposed to be. He looked at the courtyard with her. "I didn't know what it was supposed to be when I bought the building. I know. I knew what I wanted it to feel like. You helped me figure out what that meant in practice." She turned to look at him. He was already looking at her. "I want to be clear about something," she said. "Tell me. When the space opens, when it's running and people are here and it's working." She looked at him steadily. "I'm not going anywhere. This isn't a project I'm going to finish and move on from." He held the look. "Is that a professional statement or a personal one?" "Both," she said. At the same time, the room around them went quiet in the way it sometimes did when something real happened. Just for a moment, the conversations at the other end of the space, barely registering. "Okay," he said. Quietly, the same word she'd said months ago on the concrete floor, when she'd first said she'd think about it with him. She understood now why it had landed the way it had. Some words carried more than their literal meaning. Some agreements were bigger than what they said. "Okay," she said back. Miriam's voice cut across the room with a question about the ventilation cover, and the moment became the next moment. Ordinary again. Full of work. They spent 3 more hours in the building that day. She made her 2 notes from the walkthrough into a full page of adjustments. The catering consultant walked her through his staffing plan, and she had 4 things to say about it. All specific, all actionable. By the time the team left, she was the last person still in the building besides Damien. He was at the table with his laptop, looking at something, and she sat across from him finishing her notes. "You know," she said, not looking up from the notebook. When I told that man he'd made me work for free, I wasn't thinking about consequences. He looked up. I know. I was just tired. And I said a true thing. Yes, she looked at him. It's strange what true things can lead to. He looked at her with that complete attention. It is, he said. I've been thinking about that a lot. So have I. The building held them in its nearly finished quiet. The walls were painted now. The lights were installed. The floor had its final finish. What had been raw and potential was now almost what it was going to be. She thought about the night she'd found the contract at her kitchen table, the number on the 4th page. She thought about the hardware store and the right bolt for the cabinet hinge. She thought about Carolyn Park laughing over the phone. She thought about Miriam saying, "You should have been doing this 10 years ago." She thought about Marco and the cake, with her name in uneven frosting, and the bus ride home on the last night. She thought about $2.13 an hour, and a man who smiled like he'd heard something worth keeping. "I want to show you something," Damien said. He turned the laptop and pushed it across the table toward her. It was an email. From an attorney. She read the subject line and had to read it again to understand. Then she read it twice more. It was about the building on 5th Street, Rosario's building. A formal notice to Chef Russo confirming the lease terms, the rate, and the cap. But there was a second part she hadn't seen before. A clause about right of first refusal if the property was ever sold. The right belonged to the tenant. It belonged to Russo. She looked up. "When did you do this?" "January," he said. "After you told me about the project and what we were building here. You never said anything. It wasn't yours to carry," he said. "It was mine to do." She held that. "Why?" she said. He was quiet for a moment, not evasive. "Thinking, because you came back from that conversation still willing to work with me," he said. "You could have walked away and protected yourself, and nobody would have blamed you. Instead, you sat down on a concrete floor and started asking the right questions." He paused. That mattered. The restaurant and the people in it mattered. Doing right by it wasn't complicated. She looked at the email. Rosario's. 3 years of her life in a building on 5th Street, smelling of bread and olive oil and the particular end of night tired she knew by heart. She felt something she didn't have a clean name for. Not gratitude exactly, or not only that. Something that came when an act of care arrived so quietly that you almost missed it. When someone did the right thing without announcement, without asking to be thanked. She pushed the laptop back across the table. "You're a strange person," she said. The corner of his mouth moved. "I've been told. I mean that specifically." She looked at him. "In a world full of people who perform their good intentions, you just do things and don't mention them." He considered that. Performing felt hollow. "I stopped young." "What happened young?" He looked at the table for a moment. "My father was the kind of person who made speeches about how he treated people. Large speeches. Very certain." He paused, and then treated them poorly in the specific instances. He looked up. "I decided I'd rather do the thing than say the thing." She held that. It explained more than he probably intended. "It's a good way to live," she said. "It's a lonely one sometimes," he said. Not complaining. Just naming it. "Yes," she said. "I know that one too." The city outside continued its evening. Through the window she could see the first real spring light still holding in the sky, that particular March quality of lasting longer than you expected. She closed her notebook. "Damien," she said. He looked at her. "Walk me home." A pause. Not long. "Yes," he said. He closed the laptop. She picked up her bag. They walked out of the building together, into the evening, into the specific cool warm of early March, into a city that didn't know or care about the particular weight of what was beginning. They walked 2 blocks before either of them said anything, and then it was him. asking something small and ordinary about a coffee place she'd mentioned once, and she answered and asked him something back, and the conversation found its pace, easy, like it had been running alongside them all winter, just waiting to be let in. The opening happened on a Tuesday evening in April, which Damien had chosen deliberately because Tuesdays were quiet and openings on quiet nights were honest. You saw the thing without the performance of a Friday crowd, without guests who came because they'd been told to. 12 members. A soft opening, not announced publicly. 2 of the catering consultant's people in the kitchen, overseen by a chef who'd taken 3 meetings to convince and then signed on without hesitation once she understood the scale. Lena arrived 2 hours before the first guest. She walked through the space alone for 15 minutes. The ground floor entry did the thing Miriam had said it would do. The second floor was ready. The tables arranged the way they'd planned. The lighting exactly as the brief had specified. Warm without being dim. Clear without being bright. The service corridor was silent and wide and invisible. She stood in the middle of it and breathed. Then she went to the kitchen and checked in with the chef and the 2 servers she'd hired and briefed over the previous week. She asked the servers 2 questions about their approach to the first course and listened to how they answered. Both were good. One was excellent. At 7, the first member arrived. She was a woman in her 60s, a physician named Dr. Hannah Park, who'd been one of the first people Damien had sent the invitation to. She came in quietly and stood in the entry and looked at the space. "This is what I hoped it would be," she said, to no one in particular. Lena stepped forward. "Welcome, I'm Lena. Let me show you where everything is." She walked Dr. Park through the space the way she'd practiced in her head 50 times. Not a tour, more like orientation. Here is how this works. Here is what to expect. Here is what this place is for. Dr. Park sat down and looked at the menu and said, "How did you decide on this? Every dish is something that asks you to slow down to eat it properly," Lena said. "Nothing you can rush through." Dr. Park looked at her. "Whose idea was that?" "Mine," Lena said. "Good idea, Doctor," Park said. The other 11 members arrived over the next hour. The evening ran. The food was what it was supposed to be. The service was quiet and present without hovering. The room did the thing rooms did when they were right. It held people in a way they didn't notice. The conversation easy, the pauses comfortable. Damien moved through the space over the course of the evening, talking to members, observing, making notes in his notebook. He was not performing host. He was doing what he always did, paying attention. Around 9:30, when the main plates had been cleared and people were in the slower, deeper part of the evening, he came and stood beside her near the service corridor. "It's working," he said quietly. Yes, she watched the room. The thing Miriam said, about the space holding people without them noticing. I didn't fully understand what that meant until tonight. "It means they feel safe," she said. "They're not performing. Look at the table by the window." He looked. 3 members who hadn't known each other before tonight were deep in conversation, leaning in, the body language of people who'd forgotten to be careful. "That happened in the first 40 minutes, Lena said. "That's the room doing its job. That's your design doing its job." She accepted that. She'd learned to accept things instead of deflecting them. "Do you remember the evening in the building," he said, "when I said, 'People relax around you'? I remember. I want you to know I wasn't talking about a professional skill." She looked at him. The room moved softly around them. "I know," she said. "I've been patient," he said. "Not complaint, not pressure, just fact. You have. I'll keep being patient." He looked at her. "But I wanted you to know that what I said in January was not a moment. It's a constant." She held that. The room was warm around them. The evening that she'd spent months building was doing what she'd built it to do. She thought about patience. He'd talked about it before, about buying the building and waiting, about finding the right person for the project, about the partnership he'd declined because it would have made things faster, but wrong. Patience for him wasn't resignation. It was strategy. It was a way of protecting the thing. She understood that. She practiced a version of it herself, but she also knew there were moments when patience became its own kind of avoidance. "Come with me," she said. She walked to the third floor, the quiet room, the one with 4 chairs and the window that looked onto the courtyard. She heard him follow. She stood at the window. The April sky outside was dark and clear. She could see stars, a few of them, the way she sometimes could in this part of the city if the cloud cover was right. He came and stood beside her, not performing distance, just there. "I have something to tell you," she said. He waited. "The night of the hardware store, when you helped me find the right bolt. Yes, I knew when I got home that evening. I knew the drawer I'd been keeping things in was getting full." She paused. "I just wasn't ready." "And now?" She looked at the courtyard below, the small square of city that couldn't be seen from the street, the hidden thing, the private one. "And now, we built the room," she said. "And the room works, and I know the work is real and separate, and mine." She turned to look at him. "And I'm ready." He looked at her for a moment that was the right length, not too short, and not drawn out, just the exact weight of it. He didn't do anything grand. He didn't say something that would sound like a speech. He reached out and took her hand simply. "The way you held something you'd been careful with and were now allowing yourself to actually hold." She let him. Below them the courtyard was dark and quiet. Above them the building held its first evening of being what it had been built to be. She thought about a 0 on a tip line and how it had led here, through every strange and winding step, through hardware stores and concrete floors and contracts and lease agreements and 40-minute walkthroughs and late evenings and patient capital and the exact right width of a service corridor. Through all of it, to here, a woman who'd said a true thing at exactly the right moment and found out what it could lead to. She hadn't known it would lead to this. She hadn't planned it. She'd just been tired and honest, and the world had taken it somewhere. She stood at the window with his hand in hers, and the city below them, and the room above the room where 12 people were becoming something to each other over food that asked them to slow down, and she thought, "This is enough. More than enough. This is everything."